No. We'll see how else. I fall asleep in the middle. Okay, so we were in the middle of 12b, discussing this idea that Rava retracted on, that when you have the shirayim, you did the kmitza, now some flour is lacking, and then and some flour is lacking, and you went further and you did the and then you put the flour on the altar. We wanted to know, is it effective that it removes it from me'ilah and it'll have a piggle? It will be piggle or it won't be piggle. So Rava argued on Rav Huna yesterday, and he told us that zrika is not going to help. Meaning, it is going to help. That sacrificing the flour is going to help, and it was the invalidation of taking it outside, which was more stringent. But in this case, the fact that the cases that you took flour, the remnants that you're going to hopefully consume now are missing. So they're lacking. You're lacking a measurement of remnant flour, and now you go and you continue to do the kmitza. So Rava said that's a good kmitza to remove it from me'ilah, and therefore you are going to have a piggle obligation. Let's just start a few lines up. So Rava now retracts based on a brisa. So a few lines up, maybe 15 lines down on 12b. Amar Rava lav milsahi. Nope, I'm retracting. Really, the kmitza that you put on is not going to be good to remove from me'ilah, and therefore there's not going to be a piggle because it is an invalidation. That's a more extreme. Amar Rava lav milsahi. Hulan psulos are talking about the lechem upon him. You have 12 breads, 2 batches of 6 breads, and now one of them gets broken, so then they are invalid. However, that's all it says. Implication, hayatsta, hani, dikavai, sheros. If one of them was removed outside, the rest that are inside are going to remain valid. Now, man shama sedamar zrigam elas liyotze, who's the opinion that holds that throwing the blood works on meat that left the premises? That's Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva. So to here, we're assuming that whenever you have something that's been removed, the one who allows it to go through is Rabbi Akiva. And if this brisa is Rabbi Akiva, what does it say? It says that if you have a broken piece, that's going to be invalid. So just like Rabbi Akiva says that in the brisa here, that if you have a piece that's broken, that it's going to be invalidate the other ones. Should I find it for you? No. You got it? Good. No. I don't know how it works in these metric systems.
You went
way back. A little back. Right here. Just in the middle of a thought process. For those following. Don't have to reject me, you know? So Rabbi Akiva says that, Rabbi Akiva says that the broken one is not good. The implication is if it leaves, it is good. So, but we're comparing now the broken piece to the deficient measurement of flour in the remnants. And just like here, Rabbi Akiva is going to say it's no good. So too by us, he's going to say the kmitza is not good, and that would be a retraction of Rava's statement, and he actually agrees to Rav Huna. Abaye is not. This is really where we're up to. Amarle Abaye, though, he's going to reject Rava's rejection. Meaning, Rava has a rejection based off of brisa that he attributes to Rabbi Akiva. Long story short, Abaye is going to attribute the brisa to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva's counterpart, and therefore it's not going to be at all a rebuttal. It's not going to be a proof to Rava's retraction. So, Amarle Abaye, who told you the implication of this brisa is that if it's broken, it's invalid. If it leaves, it's valid. Maybe. Yatzis, Mikatani Hayatzis, who said it means the implication is it left? Dilma Hunitmes. Maybe it means Dilma Hanitmes, sorry. Maybe it means if it's broken, it's invalid. If it becomes impure, it's going to be valid. But there's nothing to talk about in terms of it leaving. And Hanitmes, Hanach Cheros, the rest of them are going to be kosher. My time. Well, why would impurifying make them valid? But if it left, it would be invalid. What's the difference? Dimaratzitz. The tzitz is going to, we know that the Kohen Gadol wears the headband, the tzitz, one of his garments. Each of the garments atones for different things. So the tzitz atones for impurity. Yeah. Aval yatz the law, but if it leaves, so then that's not going to be valid. It's going to be invalid. And then who is that opinion? Rabbi Eliezer. He done Rabbi Eliezer is Rabbi Kiva's counterpart. It says that it's not going to help you to throw blood on the altar, to sprinkle blood if the meat left the premises. So to here, it's not going to help you to offer up the bazich and the spices, the special spices by the lechem upon him if some of the bread left. Now, if you're going to tell me the Bryce is Rabbi Eliezer, so why did the Bryce mention this invalidation of leaving the premises? You're right, he could have. So why did you had one of two invalidations you could have got? The bread broke, or you removed it outside. So why'd you teach the bread broke and not this one? That even though it's broken, but it's here, it didn't leave. It being here somehow is going to help it. As we had yesterday also. It being, you would have thought that afilu nifrasa the iseh bifnim lo mahanyale aktara. That even though it's here, it's still not going to help. Even though it's inside, it's not outside. Inside is more lenient. It still remains a level of holiness. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's not going to help you to continue offering the spices by the lechem upon him, by the bread, if one of the pieces is broken. Aval Rabbi Akiva, Damar Zukam Alas Liyotze, but according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that throwing the blood, sprinkling the blood, does help you even when something left. According to Rabbi Akiva, just like when something leaves the premises, you keep going with the service and it works. So too, if you're lacking, like in our case, the flour of the remnant flour is lacking, you could also continue with the service, which is what Rava held originally. So Rava tried to retract based off of Brisa. Abaye rejects his retraction and says that you can really agree to what you said earlier, that if you have shirayim missing, if you did kmitza, and now the flour is missing, Rav Huna and Rava had a debate, does that offering of the flour, is it accomplish something? It removes it from Me'ilah, or not? So Rav Huna said not, and Rava said yes. And Abaye says that from this brisa, you can't prove one way or the other, because I just showed you that it can really agree to you. Okay. Back to our favorite topic, pickle. Yeah. So good thing we did it first in Zachem for a while. So now it's in our digestive system. Pickle. Yeah. I mean, hopefully not, but that'd be prohibited. But it's part of us now. So now we know it well. So we know you have part of the flour offering. So you have the kmitza, the flour. So let's say you have in mind kechetzi zayis. So you have the kmitza that you've scooped up. Now you're walking it over to the altar, and you're going to place that kmitza on the altar, and the altar is going to consume it. What do you do with the remnant flour? The kohanim get to bake cookies, whatever they want with it. I don't know. So and they get to eat it. So now, do they combine? You need an olive's worth for pickle. Is there a combination? So lechu kechetzi zayis ula haktir kechetzi zayis kosher. If I have in mind, so I'm going to eat half an olive's worth, and I'm going to offer up half an olive's worth outside the right place, outside the right time, one of those two. So that's still going to be a valid sacrifice because they don't combine together. You have to have a full olive's worth of consumption by human, by the altar, but these two don't combine together. Yeah? Good. Okay, implication being that eating and consuming of the altar don't combine. But let's say I had in mind half an olive's worth to consume and half an olive's worth to consume of something which is not generally consumed. What's something which is not generally consumed? The actual kmitza that goes on the altar. So I have in mind I'm going to consume a full olive's worth, half an olive's worth of remnants, which I'm allowed to go make cookies with, and the other half of the olive's worth I'm going to have in mind I'm going to consume the kmitza, which is supposed to be on the altar. That's something which is not generally consumed by a human. Or not generally, it's not consumed by a human. So the implication is only if you have in mind that you are going to consume half olive's worth, and the altar will consume half olive's worth outside the right time. That's invalid. But if you're going to consume both olives worth, and one of the olives worth is something which the altar usually consumes, or you can go the other way, that it's the altar will consume things. Well, actually, let's not go the other way. Let's just stay with this way. So, implication is that is going to be pigul. So, time of the what's the problem is the previous mishna. Pigul's only on something which is generally consumed by a human or for the altar, generally consumed by the altar. It's only something which is generally consumed by the altar, something which is not generally consumed by something which is generally consumed by the person, something which is generally consumed by the altar is not going to be valid. Okay, we're good. So we're going to say like this. Our Mishnah, we're going to stick with the implication that really our Mishnah says, as the implication implies, is that things that are not consumed, if that's the other half of your olives worth that you plan on consuming, it is going to be pigul. Now, Montana, who's the author of that Mishnah? Meaning, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, it can't be the previous Mishnah because that disagrees. So who's the author of the Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amani Rabbi Eliezer. This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The Amar, Mechashvin Machilas Adam, Lachilas Mizbeach, Machilas Mizbeach, Lachilas Adam. Rabbi Eliezer says you can have these kinds of thoughts as we're about to see. You can have thoughts that go from a consumption of a person to the altar, and they can combine, and vice versa. They can combine it from the altar to the person. Where do we see that? Let's see. It's not. It says kasher. So the first opinion of this Mishnah says you do kmitza on a flour offering to eat something which is not generally eaten, or not generally consumed, eaten, or for something that's going to go on the altar, which is not generally put on the altar. So that's going to be valid because you need only something which a person consumes or the altar consumes. If it's not something which the altar consumes, or it's not something which the person consumes, that's not going to be pigul. However, Rabbi Eliezer posel. Rabbi Eliezer says it is going to be pigul, even things that a person doesn't consume, or things that the altar doesn't consume, that's still going to count for pigul. So if you have in mind, you're going to offer up the remnants, which are usually eaten, or you're going to eat the kmitza, which is usually burnt. It's not usually, it is burnt. So that, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is going to be invalid. That would be the author of our Mishnah. Abayi says, even our Mishnah could even be the Rabbanon. But what's the problem? It's a contradiction to the previous Mishnah. So how could it be? So lo tema. So don't imply like we just implied from the Mishnah. Lo tema halechol b'lechol davar shedarko lechol ela ema halechol b'lechol davar shedarko lechol. Okay, so now the Mishnah clearly states half an olive's worth of human consumption, the remnants, and half an olive's worth of altar consumption, mitzvah, is not going to combine. Now, we're implying, however, we're implying now that something which is ema hal lechol v'lechol davar shedarko lechol. So we're implying that two things that are usually eaten are consumed do combine. So says Gemara, there's no novelty in that two olives worth of things that a person consumes can combine for pigul. It's explicit. Lechol kazayis b'chutz, kazayis l'machar, kazayis l'machar, kazayis b'chutz, kechetzi zayis b'chutz, kechetzi zayis l'machar. You can combine things that a person consumes, or you can combine two olives worth of things that the altar consumes. That we know from the previous Mishnah already. Kechetzi zayis l'machar, kechetzi zayis b'chutz, pasul, the ainbo, pasul the ainbo kares. So now, 1 second. Yeah, it's going to be invalid, and it's not going to get kares. So we already know that. So we already knew that from a previous Mishnah what those laws are. They're going to combine, but it won't be kares. Fine, but they're going to combine. So next page, hasu lamali. So what do we need this implication of our Mishnah to teach you that things that a person consumes, if you have in mind half an olive's worth I'm going to consume tomorrow, and half an olive's worth is going to be outside the right place, so it'll still be invalid. Kares will still be invalid. So I knew that already. So hasu lamali. So now, I lechol, v'lechol, davar she'ein darko lechol. If you want to tell me that we originally thought that we're going to combine things that a person consumes and the person doesn't consume, and those combine together and make pickle, okay, that was a novelty. That was our original assumption. So then, I lechol, v'lechol, davar she'ein darko lechol, kamashvan. Okay, that would be a novelty. So to that we say though, kamashvan de mitzarif, that they would combine. So we say, but Mereisha Shmas, now like repeating what we said earlier, from the earlier Mishnah, we see not that way. That things that are consumed by humans and by the altar, things that are consumed by humans that are not generally eaten, like the kmitza, or things that are consumed by the altar that are not consumed by the altar, like shirayim, they do not combine. And we knew that already from previous Mishnah. So, skipping the parentheses, if you want to tell me that things that are eaten and consumed don't combine, so that we also know Meduki the Resha, Shmas Mina, that I can learn that already from the implication of the earlier Mishnah. Why? Because the earlier, so now we're asking on the actual Mishnah, what are you teaching me? That things that a person consumes and that are consumed by the altar don't combine? Is that your whole novelty? So if it's the implication, we know that already. If it's the Mishnah itself, what are you teaching me? Why? I can learn out this halacha from the earlier Mishnah. How? Something which I'm eating half an olive's worth of kmitza and half an olive's worth of shirayim of the remnants. So that's something which I don't generally consume, kmitza. And you told me that a pigel has to be something which is consumed by a person, or if it's by the altar, that's consumed by the altar. I can't consume something that I don't consume, and the altar, if you have in mind that it's going to consume something which it doesn't consume, it's not going to be pigel. So now, that was the previous Mishnah. So just like you told me, Malechol, Belechol, Davar, Darko, Lechol, Amris, Lo Mitztarev, even things that I'm going to consume, I will consume two half olives worth. It's still not going to be pigel. Lechol ulahaktir mi bayi. So you have to teach me that if I'm going to consume half an olive's worth, and the altar will consume the other half, that doesn't combine. Even if I eat both olives worth, I have in mind to consume both olives worth. If one of the half olives worth are things that are not consumed by me, by a human, like kmitza, it's not going to go. So for sure, things that I'm not even going to consume, the altar will consume, and I'm going to consume. So I have in mind when I'm doing the kmitza that tomorrow I'm gonna consume half an olive's worth of kmitza, and the altar will consume a half an olive's worth of kmitza. So that's not going to work. So isn't that obvious already? So says the Gemara. Yeah, I need that novelty. I do need it. Why? I do need it. Why? There, when you're having in mind to consume something which is not consumed by a human, or you have in mind that the altar should consume things that are not consumed by the altar. So kmitza for a human and remnants for the altar. So deloki orcha kamachashev. You're not having in mind what's normal. It's not normal. It's not normal to consume things that you don't consume. So about hacha b'bahai ki orcha kamachashev b'bahai ki orcha kamachashev. But here, nothing's abnormal. Half an olive's worth I'm going to consume outside the right time, and the altar will consume half an olive's worth. Each one is normal for them. So I'm going to consume a cookie's worth of the remnants, half an olive's worth of a cookie that I bake tomorrow outside the right time, and the altar I'll have in mind that the altar will consume the other half olive's worth. So that's both normal. It's normal for me to consume the remnants. It's normal for the altar to consume the kmitza. So that you would have thought might be good, and you would not be able to derive that from the previous Mishnah, because the previous Mishnah told you that it's things that don't combine, or things that are not consumed by a human. I don't consume kmitza, and the altar doesn't consume shirayim. That is the previous Mishnah. But here you would have thought that if each one's doing what's normal for them, just because it's a half of olive's worth in my mind, and another half olive's worth, you would have thought from that previous Mishnah they would combine. You wouldn't know, but maybe they would combine. Kamash Malon, our Mishnah tells you, if you would have thought they do combine and it would be pigel. Kamash Malon, our Mishnah, that half an olive, if you have in mind outside the right time or outside the right place, it has to be half an olive's worth. It has to combine to an olive's worth of either I'm going to eat, or half an olive, or an olive's worth of what the altar is going to eat. But half an olive's worth of my consumption and half an olive's worth of the altar's consumption does not combine. So at the end of the day, after all the dust settles, a person has to have in mind, first of all, one criteria is that they have to have in mind what's consumed by a human. So the kmitza is by the altar. That's not going to work. You have to have in mind, if you're thinking about the altar, things that are consumed by the altar. So the remnants is not going to work. You have to do things that are darko lechel or darko lahakter. That's normal to be brought up. That's one. And therefore, those two olives worths are not going to combine. Alternatively, you also have to have in mind, or furthermore, you have to have in mind for full human consumption or full altar consumption. Half an olive's worth of a human consumption with half an olive's worth of an altar consumption is not going to combine for pigel. Okay. Going right ahead and more about pigel, don't worry. So, I know you're worried. So I come into the mincha now, you do kmitza on the mincha, and you have in mind to eat the remnants or to offer up the kmitza tomorrow. Okay. Moder Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi bazeh. Shu pigel v'chamon kares. Rabbi Yossi here agrees that it's going to be pigel and you're going to be 5 kares. Now, obviously, the Gemara is going to ask, what does it mean, Moder Rabbi Yossi? Why would you think he disagrees? So we're going to get there. That's the first question of the Gemara. But here, if you have in mind tomorrow, everyone agrees it's going to be pigel. Fine. Now, yeah. Now, what gets interesting is that the flour offerings, most of them, except for the sinner's offering, so you have the kmitza, and you have the levona, the frankincense, the spices. Now, you first scoop up the kmitza, and then you're going to scoop up afterwards. You're going to gather up the spices. Both of those are permitters, are matirim, that allow the kohanim to eat the remnants. So now, we haven't really mentioned levona until now, but now we're going to mention it. So, lahaktir levona solemachar. Let's say you have in mind, I believe it's while you're doing the kmitza, you have in mind that you're going to offer up the levona tomorrow. So you're having in mind while doing one of the permitters to invalidate another permitter. Meaning you're doing, I believe that's the case. You're doing the kmitza and you have in mind tomorrow I'm going to sacrifice the levona, or outside the right place, or I'll sacrifice it in Portland. So, yeah. Rabbi Yossi Omer Pasal ve'ein bo kares. No, invalid, no kares. The Chachamim Omer Pigel v'Chachamim kares. It is kares. So Amru Lo, they asked, and the Chachamim asked Rabbi Yossi, Mashina Zemen Azeva, by a animal offering. So when you slaughter it and you have in mind to offer up its limbs, the sacrificial parts of the animal, you have in mind tomorrow. So that is going to cause pigel. When I'm slaughtering, I have in mind something else, like I'm going to offer up the sacrificial parts tomorrow. That does cause pigel. So why, when I'm doing kmitza and I have in mind to offer up the frankincense tomorrow, is that not pigel? What's the difference? To that, Rabbi Yossi responds. Amar Lahen, he tells him back, Shehazevach Damo ubesaro ve'emur of echad. And the Gemara doesn't go through this. By a sacrifice, they're all one. The blood, the meat, and the sacrificial parts are all one. But here, ulevona eina mina mincha, cryptic statement. The frankincense is not, literally means it's not part of the mincha. It doesn't mean it's not part of the mincha. We're going to see how much it prevents the process. How much of it is we'll see. So fine. So that's going to come up in the middle of the next page. Okay. So let's see. So the first thing was going back to the Mishnah. If you do kmitza and you have in mind to eat the remnants or to offer up the kmitza tomorrow, here Rabbi Yossi agrees it's going to be pigel. Okay. Lama lila misna moder Rabbi Yossi bazu. Why are you teaching me that Rabbi Yossi agrees? What would you have thought? Mishum de, so obvious answer is going to be something he said in the latter part of the Mishnah would tick somebody off and think he would disagree in the first part of the Mishnah. That we're telling you that no, he agrees in the first part of the Mishnah. That's the outline. So, Moder Rabbi Yossi bazu mishum de kabayi lemisni seifa. What is saying in the last part of our Mishnah? Lahakti levanasa. If you have in mind while doing the kmitza to offer the frankincense, the macha Rabbi Yossi omer pasol ve'ein bo kares. Rabbi Yossi says it's invalid and there's not going to be kares. What would you have thought? Now, why does Rabbi Yossi hold that when I'm doing the kmitza and I have in mind the frankincense that it's not going to be pigel? At least it won't be kares. It may be invalid, but not kares. So we're going to have different reasons for Rabbi Yossi. The first suggested reason is what you would have thought would apply to the first part of the Mishnah. We're going to reject that reason, and therefore the other reason for Rabbi Yossi is not going to apply to the first part of the Mishnah. However, if you would read the Mishnah, you would come to the following conclusion. That if you do, you can't do pigel on half of the matir. So we have two matirs, two permitters, the kmitza and the frankincense. You thought very simply that you cannot have in mind one of the permitters while doing another one. You have to have in mind the kmitza during the kmitza. So if that's true, va'afilu reisha nami, so even the reisha, you would have thought that if I just have in mind, one second, va'afilu reisha nami, that yeah, I think it means that you would think that you have to have both in mind, both the kmitza and the frankincense to do pigel. Having only one of them in mind is not going to work. So you would have thought that because if the last part of the Mishnah is, I can't have in mind one of the permitters for another one, meaning when I'm doing one of them, I can't have in mind another one, maybe I have to have both of them together, and only having one of them in mind is not going to be valid. From the fact that Rabbi Yossi agrees that if you just have in mind the kmitza, consume outside the right time, that it is going to be pigel. So we see that kmitza, its invalidation of pigel, is irrelevant to what you have in mind by the frankincense. Each one has their own rules. Not their own rules. Each one is their own thing. So if you do the kmitza and you have in mind to consume outside the right time, outside the right place, it's going to be pigel. You don't have to have in mind both permitters. So Kamash Malon, turn the page. The Baha Moda. Kamash one that here Rabbi Yossi agrees, and therefore we need a new reason for why he disagrees in the last part of the Mishnah. But this is not the reason, because if it was the reason, then it would be invalid in the beginning of the Mishnah, and that's not true. Okay. Now, speaking of the next part of the Mishnah, if I'm doing the kmitza and I have in mind the frankincense is going to be consumed tomorrow, which is outside the right time, which should get kares, now, that one matir cannot cause pigel to another matir. This is different than the one we just said, right? That was ein mefaglin bechatzi matir. 1 second. 1 second. Yeah, that's what I thought also. Yeah. So this one is Amar Shlakish, Omar Rabbi Yossi, Ein Matir, Mefaglas Matir. So it's not that Pigel doesn't apply by half of a Matir, by half of it. That's not what it's saying. That it's not that you need both permitters to have Pigel. No, it's just when you're doing one of them, you can't have in mind the other one. So originally we thought, which we just rejected, was that Pigel is a full package. Both permitters, you have to have in mind both permitters, Kmitza and Lavona, flour and frankincense. Together, I'm going to have to have a thought about them together. So we're saying, no, you don't need that. However, you can have Pigel for Kmitza alone, and you can have Pigel for Lavona alone. But when you're doing Kmitza, you can't have in mind the Lavona. That's not going to cause Pigel. And that's what it means. Ein matir mefaglas matir. One is not going to cause invalidation for the other one. But not that you need both. You don't need both. You can have in mind Kmitza, invalidates. You have in mind to consume the Kmitza. Lavona, you have in mind to invalidate the Lavona. Now, we're going to see more about this in the next Mishnah, that we have, right, 6 breads and 6 breads, 12 bread, lechem upon him, and there is frankincense. There is frankincense, two little bowls called the bazichin. Each of them has the frankincense. They have the lavona. They're going to be offered up and onto the temple. That's like the permitter for consuming the bread. Okay. Now, so one of them is not going to cause pigul to the other. So if you have, let's say, if you're offering up one of the bowls of the frankincense of the lechem upon him, of the bread, and you have in mind that you're going to consume the other one tomorrow, so that's not going to work because one can't invalidate the other. So, Ma'i v'chena omer. What do you need to bring me like another proof? And you find a similar thing. Why is that necessary? Ma'hu the because you would have thought the time of Rabbi Yossi b'lavona mishum delav mina de minchahi aval b'shnei bazichin lavona de mina de hadadin and who ema mefagli hadadi kamash malam. You would have thought that our case of flour and frankincense by a flour offering differs from both frankincense by the lechem upon it. By lechem upon it, there's 2 bowls of frankincense. You'd have thought those are both the same species, the same kind. They're both frankincense. So maybe there it would work. By our case, doing the flour and having in mind the frankincense is 2 separate things. That's why it doesn't work. To which we said no. It doesn't work even by the 2 of the exact same bowls of frankincense by the lechem ha'apon. Okay. Now, on that, what we just said, that there's a difference if it's different species, if they're different, flour and frankincense is different. That's what you would have thought. So, umi matis amris time of Rabbi Yossi b'lavona, mimas amris time of Rabbi Yossi b'lavona, lav mishum de lav mina de minchahi. Could you really have thought that the reason of Rav Yossi would have been because Livona, frankincense is different than flour? V'hakatani seifa. Look at the end of the Mishnah. Amrulo, the Chachamim said to Rav Yossi, Ma shinsa min hazevach. What's the difference between the Livona and the flour to a regular sacrifice, or if you're doing the slaughtering and you have in mind the to consume the sacrificial parts outside the right time, it's going to be invalid. And how did he respond? Amar lahen hazevach damo ubisaro ve'emurav echad v'levona eino min mincha. And the frankincense is not really part of the mincha. So, what does Rav Yossi mean when he said the Lavona is not part of the mincha? My eina min mincha. What it means is eina be'ikuv mincha. Delav ki hechi de ma'akev lehu kometz. Eina be'ikuv mincha, meaning. One second. Sorry, the Gemara was asking on Rabbi Yossi. Isn't the reason for Rabbi Yossi is because frankincense is different than the flour? That was the question. When we matzahs armor is time to Rabbi Yossi, that's the reason. The reason why Rabbi Yossi says that it really is different by flour is because flour and frankincense are different species. So that's really why he says it, and therefore it's not really similar to the two bowls of frankincense by the bread. And how do I know that? Because when Rabbi Yossi responded to the rabbis, what did he say? He said, "It's the frankincense is ein min mincha. It's not part of the flour. One's flour, one's frankincense. So how can you tell me that that's not where Rabbi Yossi holds? That's what he says. Says the Gemara, no. My ein min mincha. What does it mean that it's not part of the mincha? What it means is eino be'ikuv mincha. Meaning, really, the reason Rabbi Yossi is like we said originally was that one permitter. When you're doing one permitter, if you have in mind the other one, then it's not going to be pigul. And now, what did Rabbi Yossi mean? What did Rabbi Yossi mean that it's not part of the mincha? What it means is that by a sacrifice, so the blood permits the sacrificial parts to be brought on the altar. So they're very connected. The blood itself is what permits the sacrificial parts to be put on the altar. You need that. But by the levona, by the frankincense, so you don't need the kmitza for the levona, and you don't need the levona for the kmitza. You need both of them for the remnants. That's true. But you don't need them for each other. You can do the levona or you can do the frankincense. Sounds like you could do. You're not waiting for the frankincense to do the levona, to do the flour, and you're not waiting for the flour to do the frankincense. So the lavki heichi de ma'akiv kometz l'shirayim, the kamad lav meskater kometz lo mesak l'shirayim. So hachanami ma'akiv lo levona. Ella ibay hayimak teberesha, ibay hayimak teberesha. The difference is that we're talking about when you're doing flour. You're scooping up flour and you're having in mind frankincense. So how does that differ from a regular sacrifice with blood and meat and sacrificial parts? So Rabbi Yossi says it's very different. The blood is what permits the sacrificial parts. So therefore, if I have in mind that I'm going to consume the sacrificial parts outside, let's say I'm doing the blood. I'm sprinkling the blood I have in mind. I'm going to consume the sacrificial parts outside the right time. Well, those are dependent on each other, and therefore it's going to be pigul. But the frankincense and the flour, the kmitza, they don't prevent each other. You could do the frankincense first and then the kmitza, or you could do the kmitza first and then the frankincense. So even though they both do prevent the remnants from being consumed, but they don't prevent each other. And therefore they're less connected to each other. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, if you have in mind the frankincense while doing the flour, while doing the kmitza, that is not going to cause pigul, and you won't get kares. Yeah, good. Okay. So yeah, part a little complicated. Okay, so yeah. What do the rabbis hold? When do they say this idea that one permitter is not going to cause pigul if you have the other permitter in mind? Skimming the parentheses. That's when they're not in one vessel, as we're going to see the two animals, the two anshuvos, two lambs, sheep. Sheep. The two sheep you bring on Shavuos, so they're different. Those two animals, so that's not in the same vessel. We're going to see more about that in the next Mishnah. But here, it's in the same vessel. Here, Here you're putting the frankincense on top of the flour. You're putting the flour on top of the frankincense. So it's all in one vessel. That's much more united. That's much more one. And therefore, the Rabbanan agree to the rule that Rav Yossi is saying, but they don't agree to the application. The application is going to apply on Shavuos when you have two different animals. One, if you have in mind, when you're involved in one animal's service, the other animal's consumption outside the right time, that's where it's not going to work. But here it's all in one vessel. That is going to work. Okay. Amar of Yana, Liko Devona Bizarre Puzzle. Who can do the scooping of the frankincense? Can a non-Kohen do it? So Rav Yana says no. Now there's a seemingly problematic comment here from Rashi. I saw they pointed out. Legal Lavona simply means, like a Gemara Sota implies, that you're doing the frankincense after the flour, before the burning of the altar. Which is interesting. Rashi says that you're gathering the frankincense after you put up the komex, after you put up the flour, then you go and bring up the frankincense. So it seems to be against the Gemara, so you have to know how to work it out. But the point is, the gathering of the frankincense cannot be done by a non-Kohen. The answer is no, and I see we're running out of time. My time one more. Because right now Rabbi Yirmiyah holds it's one of the services, and if it's one of the services, only a Kohen can do it. And we'll see if it's really one of the services of walking or it's a different service. And we'll continue with the next question.